2025 was an epic year for world news and fulfilled Bible prophecy. It began with Donald Trump's miraculous return to office, being sworn in at the White House. It included his repeated attempts to bring peace just about anywhere and everywhere, the rise of the German war machine, the increased military revival of Japan, the cementing of a new Pan-Asian alliance, and we've assembled a full, in-person, pretty much, panel to discuss all of this and much more for today's Trumpet World. Welcome back to Trumpet World. Once again, the Trumpet Daily have been very kind to lend us their studio. We've gotten our biggest ever in-person panel together. Jeremiah Jacques to talk mostly about Asia, Andrew Miiller to cover Anglo-America, Josué Michels will be talking about Europe, and we couldn't quite get him in person. Mihailo Zekic is joining us online to talk about the Middle East. And of course, all of our panelists, we're not going to confine ourselves to just those areas. We hope to have some good discussion on this show as we review the top stories of last year. And one of the biggest stories of 2025 is the rise of the German war machine. We began the year with German elections, the victory of Friedrich Merz, immediately announcing that he was going to, or would have Parliament, change the German constitution so there were no limits on how much money the German military could borrow, or that Germany could borrow to fund its military. We are also seeing this year some of the big increases in German military spending that happened in years previously start to pay off, and the German military start to get some of that equipment delivered and get their capacities expanded. We've seen Germany debate the reintroduction of conscription, open its first overseas military base, and German military companies like Rheinmetall soar to new heights. And I did a show a few weeks back that looked at what Trumpet Editor-in-Chief Gerald Fleury had to say about much of that. So we have a deeper dive there that we could put a link to in the show notes. But perhaps we can start by going to Josué Michels for any thoughts you may have to add on those stories.
Yes, the militarization part is definitely the biggest story. And if you read any article, they talk about Russia's war in Ukraine kind of triggering that militarization. In a sense, that is true, but Germany is not there just afraid of Russia. They could have stopped that war a long time ago. Just remember when in 2022 that war started, Germany was there and said, Russia is surrounding you with tanks, we will send you 5,000 helmets and some sleeping bags to help you protect and fend off that invasion. Of course, that did not scare Russia at the time. And then Russia did invade, and Germany was the one that blocked a lot of the arms deliveries from other countries. They were not allowed to use German airspace, for example, and they also blocked critical sanctions on oil, gas, and also on the SWIFT payment systems, so that Russia would not be excluded, that Russia essentially was able to go on with that war. So that just shows that Germany could have stopped that war in many ways.
Or at least been more supportive of Ukraine. I guess we have the counterfactual of what would have happened if Germany had given more weapons earlier on. I don't know if we can know fully the outcome of that, but certainly they could have been a lot more supportive of Ukraine than they have been.
Yeah, so the main point is that Germany is right now spending hundreds of billions on the military. And they're sending a fraction to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So if this was about stopping Russia from invading to Ukraine, they could do that in multiple ways with a united Europe together with America. If those nations would be cooperating, they could do something that actually helps the Ukrainian people. But what they are doing is, it's a different story. They are arming themselves with hundreds of billions, sending a fraction to the Ukrainian people.
And just, that reminds me of what we saw at the start of the Ukraine war, less so now, where you had the so-called backfilling, where European countries got rid of their old, almost obsolete equipment. They handed that to Ukraine and then got shiny new equipment, and often subsidized by the United States, very heavily subsidized by the United States. And so you had all of these things that were being celebrated as we're helping Ukraine, when it was actually, no, we're buying new toys for our military and giving the hand-me-downs to Ukraine.
And the main reason they did it, they said, well, the Ukrainian people, they can't really handle the new technology. They would need so much time to be trained on that military equipment. Now, in hindsight, they had all that time, of course. And the Ukrainian people are not as stupid as they have thought. They are learning quite quickly with those technologies, which is another point. They're learning to use drone warfare, unlike any other nation right now. And that's one of the most advanced military tools that has been being produced in that Ukraine war. And Germany has had some military partnerships with the Ukrainian people, with the Ukrainian military. But again, what Germany is doing here, it's learning the military warfare. Some have said that what used to take years of military developments is now taking place within months or weeks. And Germany is taking full advantage of that side.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. This is the year of drone warfare. I mean, we saw this before with Azerbaijan's invasion of Armenia, but if we're doing a year in review, the pace of which war has changed. Like drones, okay, during the war on terror, America used drones to take out terrorists and things like that. Ukraine is estimated to be producing somewhere around 1,000 to 1,500 drones every day. Like, we are in a new era of drone warfare, radically different from what we've had before. And even I think the drone warfare of January 2026 has probably changed a lot compared to the drone warfare of January 2025. And so they're there. Overall tactical drone deployment, that was just, the 1,000 drones was just interceptor drones. I'm just checking my notes. The actual tactical drone deployment, 5,000 to 9,000 units per day. And this is very unique, and there's a lot to learn from this. And so this is why Germany wasn't really involved at the beginning, but they are kind of sending more and more people over there. And a lot of countries are sending, Palantir, this private company is heavily involved. People need to understand how this is being fought, because like the war of the future is being fought in front of us.
It's fought on the Ukrainian blood. The Ukrainian people are the ones engaging in the warfare, and the Russians are engaging in the warfare, but the people developing the technology, the military technology, are the ones profiting from it, which is true in so many cases. But it's the most advanced German startup right now. It's a military startup. It's a startup that produces drones that are being used in Ukraine. It's the company Helsing that's raking in billions of dollars right now because of that war, and it's transforming the German landscape, and it's shifting the German nature of industry toward warfare. There was one of the articles that we highlighted in this year was that every industry is becoming an arms manufacturer in Germany. But again, we have to remember that the German economy after World War II, it was designed to be able to make that shift. It is designed to be dual use. Its car industry can be producing tanks, for example. So if you look at the chemical industry, it can produce chemical weapons. So if you go down the list, when they are saying that every industry is starting to side into the arms manufacturers, it was designed for that very purpose.
So before we move on from the Ukraine war, maybe now's an opportune time to go to Jeremiah. And I mean, one of the biggest, most important parts of the Ukraine war is the effect that's having on Europe, as you've highlighted. But maybe you could give us just a bit of an overview as to how this war has. It seems wrong to be saying how a war has progressed, but how this war has progressed over the course of 2025.
Sure, yes. Well, of course, Russia continued to wage this brutal war throughout the year, and 2025 was the deadliest year for Russia of the whole war so far. Altogether, Russia has suffered now at least 1.2 million casualties since the war began more than 4 years ago, or nearly 4 years ago, I should say. So that's 1.2 million killed or injured, and more than 400,000 of those were from 2025 alone. And then the year, of course, was also extremely devastating for Ukraine as well. They suffered more than 13,000 civilian casualties. Just in 2025, around 2,300 of those were dead and 11,000 injured. Ukraine also suffered severe energy infrastructure destruction and just a deeply strained economy, some territorial losses as well, though those appear to have been fairly limited for the year. But if we think about all of this from the perspective of the Europeans, 2025 would have been deeply alarming just to see that Vladimir Putin does not seek peace. You know, it would have been alarming, I think, for them to see that he's determined to keep on prosecuting this war despite these extremely heavy losses that are increasing for Russia. And so they see that he will keep on fighting it until he receives exactly what he wants, or perhaps unless he faces some very significant battlefield setbacks. But I think that from the European standpoint, this would be very sobering to bear witness to his unwavering determination, and just to see these mass missile strikes on Ukrainian civilian centers, mass drone strikes as well, and to see Putin also station nuclear-capable Oreshnik missiles in Belarus, where they can strike European capitals in just a few moments' time. So we can be sure that all of this is terrifying to a lot of the Europeans, especially in the eastern part of the continent. And I think that this is all prompting them to be more urgent about uniting and militarizing.
We'll just add to that this fear that Jeremiah is talking about is driving people to Germany. Poland, who was invaded in World War II by Germany, brutally butchered by both Russia and Germany in that war, is now allowing German fighter jets patrolling their airspace because of drone incursions from Russia. Romania is also allowing German fighter jets to be patrolling their airspace again to protect them. And Lithuania, as we mentioned in the introduction, even allows a permanent military base from Germany, all in protection against Russia. But again, from a German point of view, this is exactly what they always wanted, and they could not achieve in 2 world wars. They are now gaining that advantage.
And it reminds me of this classic trumpet print cover we had when Vladimir Putin invaded the very first time back in 2014. Or was that even the first time? But I lose track because he keeps invading different bits of Ukraine. But Mr. Fleury, trumpet editor-in-chief Gerald Fleury, had an article, "The Crimean Crisis is Reshaping Europe." And the cover of the trumpet print was running from Russia. And it was a picture of all the Europeans running from the ferocious Russian bear towards the German eagle. And we saw that in 2014. We're seeing it at a whole nother level. And that's something Mr. Fleury drew a lot of attention to there. I mean, he wrote in that 2014 article, "We've been prophesying for around 70 years that Eastern Europe would become a vital part of a new European superpower, a resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire. This prophecy is directly related to the Crimean crisis. The fear you see in Europe because of events in Crimea," and it was just Crimea Russia was invading back then, "is going to cause 10 leaders in Europe to unite in a sudden and dramatic way and in precise accordance with the Bible's description of that European empire." In our February edition, I wrote about Ezekiel 28 and verse 2, which talks about the Prince of Russia and the trouble he will cause in this end time. The way that prophecy is coming to pass is having a fierce impact on Europeans, far more than any other people in this world. And in that article, he talked about this prophecy in Ezekiel 38 and verse 2 that talks about a prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Now, you don't see that in the King James. Rosh in Hebrew, it can be a proper noun, or it can be, it's like the English name Rob. Depending on the context, Rob can be a guy or it can mean to steal. And it's kind of the same there, where they translated Rosh in the King James a little bit incorrectly. But it's about this prince of Russia. And Mr. Fleury back then said, well, this is Vladimir Putin. Again, all the way back in 2018, he said that prophesied prince of Russia is a powerful man, and he is having a forceful effect on Europe. The reaction within Europe to this crisis is something you need to watch, because it is shaping and molding the future composition of the Holy Roman Empire. It is making European leaders move urgently to tie together this Holy Roman Empire that we've been prophesying about for so many years. That is exactly what we saw. this. I mean, that's a very practical, there's a single scripture that you can turn to, and you can understand pretty simply that caused Mr. Flurry to make that forecast. And that has defined the news for this year. And I think it's worth bringing Andrew in on this because, well, the very next subhead in Mr. Flurry's article is no trust in America. And that's a huge part of it. I mean, you mentioned just how remarkable it is to have Poland trusting in Germany. And a big part of the reason they're doing that is like they would prefer to trust the United States. The United States does not have a long history of repeatedly invading Poland. But you know what the United States does have is quite a long history of abandoning Poland. And not just the United States, Britain and France as well in World War II. There's already this kind of condition in Europe where they fear America's not going to stick around. And, well, that's a fear that got amplified this year. And that just plays into, well, okay, we prefer to trust America. We prefer to rely on America. But we have to go to Germany. I mean, right now, the United States is actively encouraging people, don't trust us, go to Germany.
Right, yeah, that was a very premonition headline, no trust in America, because this was back at a time when America was not doing much to defend Ukraine, but at least nominally giving them a lot of verbal support. Where now, under the Trump administration, just in this past year, we've actually have an official foreign policy white paper published last month, December 5th, for all the nations on the world, our friends and our enemies to read, that basically is laying out the Trump administration's strategic vision for American security. And this paper, it's built around 3 pillars, where despite the rhetoric about the trade war with China, Donald Trump's administration says he wants strong economic ties with China. He wants a renewed focus on the Western Hemisphere, and he wants Europe to start taking charge of its own defenses. So basically saying that, we want an economic relationship with China, but we'd really like it if Germany could just, take over defending Europe so that we can focus on Venezuela and on Cuba and on Panama and all these other crisis hotspots in our own backyard. And so we're already seeing that pivot this year with Donald Trump. He's currently in the midst of regime change in Venezuela, realistically looking at regime change in Cuba soon as their economic lifeline to Venezuela gets cut, but wanting to pull out of Europe. And he famously promised on his campaign that if he was elected, he was going to get an armistice or a truce or a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia within 24 hours. He seems to have dramatically underestimated the resolve of both sides to win this conflict. Ukraine would like its lost territory back, and Russia would like to conquer quite a bit more of Ukraine. And so neither of them are eager for an armistice that just kind of draws a border along the current lines. But the U.S. is definitely still pushing for that. So if you're a Pole or a Czech or a Lithuanian or a Ukrainian, and for years you've been wondering, is America going to defend us, or do we need to make arrangements with Germany? Trump's very blatantly stated, he's like, I really don't want to defend you guys, and I'd like to start making arrangements with Germany. I'm not just going to drop you at Russia's mercy cold turkey tomorrow, but we're trying to pass the baton here, where Germany takes more charge over Europe, so we can focus more charge over the Western Hemisphere, which is one of the biggest prophetic stories of this year, because like I said, Mr. Herbert Armstrong had been talking about since the 40s about Germany rising up and leading this military superstate over Europe. And for many decades after he said that, there'd be whisperings from the Nazi underground that they wanted to do that. But on the surface, the Marshall Plan was very much in effect. And so it's only been really in the past several months that America's very verbally come out and be like, no, we want a German-led United States of Europe that can stand up to Russia and that can take charge of the defense of the Baltics and Poland and these other places because we have other problems on this side of the globe we'd like to focus on.
And that's, I mean, what you're saying, you're not really even putting words or even summarizing or simplifying that much to what Donald Trump and his administration are saying. I mean, they are saying, we want to see a German be the supreme commander of NATO's ground forces, a position that has always been held by an American general. And they are very explicitly saying, Germany is our successor. And they're also kind of saying, okay, we're not like making a German, putting this in this command position today, but we're going to do it a lot more quickly than a lot of people are comfortable with. It's not necessarily even going to be a long, drawn-out handover. It's something that America is very urgent about, and about having Germany step up. And it also shows, like I like the way you put it, it connects. All of these different prophecies are very interconnected. And it is the problems at home, the problems with the American economy, which of course is not just a 2025 story, it's a long-term story that is causing America to back out, and that is, then spurring the rise of Germany. So we'll get into all of that in just a moment. But before we do, maybe we can come back to Josué and talk about other important news stories that we've seen from Europe this year.
Yes, it actually connects to what Andrew was just saying, that as America's withdrawing, they're also not just withdrawing from Europe, they're also trying to withdraw from the Middle East. And that scenario actually brings Israel and Germany much closer together. A Jerusalem Post article on December 28th made a point: as the superpower is withdrawing, the regional powers have to come together to form an alliance to fill the void of that leaving superpower. In December, Israel exported the Arrow 3 missile defense system to Germany. It was just installed on around December 3rd and was Israel's biggest weapons export in its history. They have developed technology that's better than anyone in the other technology in the world. So Germany is now using that Arrow 3 system, and they are saying again it's to defend against Russia, and that's partly true, but the system also can defend against ballistic missiles from Iran, and Iran still has a lot of those. So Israel and Germany, they have a common enemy or a threat from Iran, and that drives them together.
Yes, that Jerusalem Post article that you mentioned I thought that was pretty surprising. You wrote a trumpet brief on that last week. And when I saw the title, I was kind of like, really? Surely nobody is talking about Germany and Israel in the Middle East replacing the United States. Like, I mean, it's prophetic, absolutely. But I don't know. I guess I just had a hard time seeing somebody actually saying that, because you do look on paper, and America spends a lot more on its defense than these two. But that is literally what this article is saying, that at least for the Middle East, okay, maybe not as a global power, but for the Middle East, this team of Germany and Israel together can replace the role the United States has played, and it can kind of come in and stabilize the region and take care of terrorists. And I mean, it's remarkable how much Israel is looking to Germany. And that's another very important story that we're watching for. I mean, that was right after October 7th. Trumpet editor-in-chief Gerald Fleury said, well, the most important thing to watch after this horrible attack on Jews from Hamas is Germany, and how Germany responds. And what we've seen is this really close relationship developing between Israel and Germany.
Yes, and if you look at, as you said, the Middle East, the most important threat is Iran. And if you combine the strength of Germany and combine the strength of Israel, they have more enough power to tackle that challenge. And then you've also see that, unlike Israel, Germany has very good connections to the Arab world, and that's something Mr. Fleury has pointed out. They have good connections to the Jordanian people, to Saudi Arabia, to Turkey. So if you have an alliance, as he mentioned, an alliance against Iran, you have more than enough power to bring, as they would see it, some stability to that region. But for me, it's even more strange for Israel to look to Germany, not just because of the historic parallels of the Holocaust. You have the descendants of the Holocaust going to a nation that executed in meticulous detail the Holocaust, killing 6 million Jews. But you also have in this very last year, you had a sign of very strong opposition from Germany against Israel. For example, in August, they had a partial arms embargo against Israel, that they could not use German weapons in their war against Hamas terrorists. And those Hamas terrorists, just 2 years ago, slaughtered more than 1,000 Israelis and took them hostage and kept them hostage. They slaughtered babies, they raped, brutal warfare. But Germany was like, no, you got to make peace with them. At the same time, they have been putting an air bridge into Gaza, feeding the Gazan people so they can sustain that war. Of course, it's all disguised as humanitarian aid, but for years, Germany has been funding the Gazan people's education. And a German paper in 2021 pointed out, for years, Berlin has ignored warnings that German taxpayers' money also finances Arabic textbooks that demonize Israel and declare Jews to be enemies of Islam. So that has been going on for years. In fact, it happened before World War I that Germany built an alliance with the Ottoman Empire to stir hatred against the Jews and the British. It happened in World War II. It happened when Nazis fled Germany after World War II and settled in Egypt and Syria and Iraq, where they were organizing resistance and hatred against the newly founded state of Israel. So if you look into the details, and some German papers discuss these recent developments and saying like, hey, why is Germany on the one side teaching young Palestinian people to hate Jews, funding the terrorist organizations of the next generation, while at the same time pretending to be Israel's friend?
Thank you for that, Joshua. And I think there's a couple more stories that we need to slot in from Europe, one of which is 2025 European politics has continued to be an absolute mess. In many ways, that mess has continued. I mean, Friedrich Merz is the ruler of a pretty unstable coalition, a coalition that at one point in time, it used to be that the Social Democrats and the Christian Democratic Union, these mainstream left and right parties in Germany, were getting about 50% of the vote. Now combined, they barely scrape 50% of the vote. That leads to a very unstable Germany, and Merz moved so decisively on the military, he got a lot of support for that at the start of his time in office, which I think tells you a lot about where modern Germany is, that boosting the military makes you wildly popular. But then, as he's dithered on social issues, as this coalition has struggled to get reforms within the country over the line, he's had some falls in popularity. Feels like he's recovered that a little bit in recent weeks as he's kind of gone back to focusing on the military. The Alternative for Deutschland, though, in Germany is the most popular party, still with about a quarter of the vote, or a little over a quarter of the support of the people in opinion polls. So you're seeing the continued rise of this basically a neo-Nazi party in Germany. And it's not just Germany. We had the government fall in the elections, they had coalitions, it's quite a complicated situation. They're still doing coalition negotiations there. We've seen France have something like 7 governments in the last 2 or 3 years, with their governments falling, sometimes barely lasting a few weeks and falling, as they try to deal with the rise of the National Rally, the former National Front, and this fringe party there. It's the story all across Europe. And we're watching for the rise of the German strongman. And this, we kind of finished up talking about our review of European news through the lens of what Mr. Fleury has written, talking about is that we're getting very, very close to the rise of the German strongman. And if we were to copy some of the programs in the world and make bets on what we expect to happen in 2026 will be the big story of 2026. I would suspect 2025 is the year of the German war machine, or the rise of the German war machine. I would expect I don't know whether it'll be right here, but when we're talking again this time next year, it would not surprise me at all if we're talking about 2026, the rise of the German strongman. And we're watching for this new United States of Europe. And there have been a lot of things that have pushed it towards, say, the status of replacing the United States. And the biggest thing holding it back from being a replacement, a rival, ultimately a victor over the United States is its disunity. United States single president, single currency, single national identity. Europe, okay, they've got some things like that, but they also have 3 presidents and they've got a single currency, but there's still a lot of division, and those states are not as unified as the United States are. This is one of the big changes that we're watching for. The rise of the German strongman, well, that is a major part of what's going to help unify these. But another major part is going to be the Catholic Church. And we saw a very significant development along those lines this year as well, with the death of Pope Francis and then the arrival of Pope Leo, the first American Pope. So, it sounds very remarkable, but actually the first American Pope has taken some important steps towards what is ultimately going to help bring Europe together. So, Andrew, you've written quite a few articles about Pope Leo and some of what he's been up to this year. Could you give us a bit of a review of what he's been doing?
Yeah, that was a huge development this year. It took a lot of people by surprise. Pope Francis was older. It was expected that he'd die soon. When he did die, they had a conclave. I feel like most Vatican watchers, at least the ones I was reading, expected the papacy to go back to an Italian. There were 3 or 4 really strong Italian candidates, which ended up being kind of their downfall, is that the Italian lobby at the conclave was divided between these 4 conclaves. I think that's probably one of the reasons they got Robert Prevost into the office, and that since he is a U.S. citizen, he was born and raised in Chicago. English is his mother tongue, although he spent the vast majority of his career as a priest and as a bishop in Peru. So he's almost more like the second Latin American pope than the first American pope. Very similar to Pope Francis in many ways. Little less woke. He's come out and made some statements about marriage being between a man and a woman, and homosexuality and transgenderism being wrong in ways that Pope Francis just avoided talking publicly that dogmatic about. But in terms of his economic vision, he's very much a duplicate of Francis. As a matter of fact, that's why he took the name Leo the 14th. Is the last Leo, Leo the 13th, was an Italian pope back during the 19th century, during the height of the Industrial Revolution. Really came in promoting Catholic social doctrine, saying that, hey, we need Catholic priests running the world's economies to make sure that the poor aren't excluded. Mr. Prevost saying that the AI revolution is almost bringing us through a 4th industrial revolution. At least that's the term Klaus Schwab coined to describe what's happening in the world economies right now. And said we really need another Leo to look out for the poor. So he's telegraphed his desire to really take a very hands-on, managerial, pro-socialist approach to world economics, while being a little more traditional than Francis, at least in the way he talks about family values, the way he dresses. So interesting approach there, because we do know from Bible prophecy, Revelation 18 speaks about an end-time church that has diplomatic relations with the kings of the earth, and just as significantly, the merchants of the earth. Talking about the merchants of the earth wailing when Babylon falls. So strong prophetic indications that this Catholic Church, it's not only going to help Europe unite politically, but it definitely plays a huge economic role in the end time, and a huge role in bringing Christians together behind this European-led economic system. It had just so happened that this year was the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. That's when Emperor Constantine, first Roman Empire to legalize Christianity within the Roman Empire, first Roman Empire to actually convert to Catholicism, and then had this state-run council, which was, I think, the first time, definitely the first time in Rome, I think the first time anywhere in the world. There was an Armenian king who converted to Christianity a little before Constantine, but I don't think he got too involved in politics. So the first time really anywhere that the government in Rome got involved in enforcing Christian doctrine, calling this Council of Nicaea to formalize what the Catholic Church taught about the Trinity and the date for Easter. And so Pope Francis had big plans to celebrate the 1700th anniversary of Nicaea with the Eastern Orthodox churches. Pope Leo honored those plans. They originally wanted to do that on the actual anniversary back in June, and then since he'd just been inaugurated Pope, he decided to wait till November because the Feast of St. Andrew is in November, and St. Andrew is allegedly the first bishop of Constantinople. So another overture to the Eastern Orthodox churches. But it's a really symbolic Council of Nicaea. I mean, if you haven't read much about it, it could seem kind of obscure, but it's really the Nicene Creed that they produced outlining the Catholic belief about the Trinity is now basically considered like the lowest common denominator of what it means to be a Christian by both the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches. So this creed really gave them the chance that they recited the Nicene Creed at the church service they had in Istanbul. And they had Pope Leo and the heads of like 27 other churches. There was a Lutheran there was an Anglican there. Most of the rest were Eastern Orthodox. But he's really kind of using Nicaea and the Trinity as kind of like your lowest common denominator. It's like, well, anyone who believes in the Nicene Creed, we've got a starting point for our discussions about full communion, becoming one church again. Most European nations are like England's Anglican, Germany's divided between Catholic and Lutheran. Greece is Eastern Orthodox. Most of the rest are Catholic. But if you can really get those 27 churches that were at this Nicene celebration on the same page, you do have a religious glue binding together the nations of the European Union. And I believe that's the exact phrase Herbert W. Armstrong used to describe the Roman Catholic Church's role in this coming United States of Europe, as it's the glue that binds the whole thing together.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Andrew. I think that just about wraps up or a lot of the major news events for Europe. I mean, there's so much of importance. It's hard to be too certain that we won't kind of be like, oh, wait, we forgot to mention this or that, or something later turns out to be huge. But we can move on now to the United States. And again, for the United States, well, the biggest story has been President Trump's return to office. And I talked about that already with Andrew last week, where we had a show on what Mr. Gerald Flurry has had to say about the United States. And as he wrote on that, he largely focused on President Trump's peace initiatives, his relationship with the Jews, the Christian revival. So I point you back to that show where we have a lot more in depth on those subjects. So we'll talk about some of the other subjects, I think, for now, that have been major news events from the United States. But maybe before we do that, perhaps Jeremiah, you weren't there when we were talking last week about some of these other stories. Perhaps you could give some of your comments as well on some of those different peace deals that we've seen from President Trump over the last year.
Sure, yes. Well, the main one that I've been keeping an eye on is what Mr. Miiller mentioned earlier, and that is the efforts to broker a peace between Russia and Ukraine. And I think it's been very troubling to see the way President Trump has pursued this. You know, the American people, a strong majority of them, have a reasonable degree of clarity in the way they see this war. It's not hard to understand that Russia is the one that invaded Ukraine. It's not hard to see that if the Russians stopped fighting and went home, the war would end. And polls consistently show that Americans understand those basic facts. Just last month, a poll showed that 74% of Americans continue to view Russia as the clear aggressor, and 87% of Americans believe that Vladimir Putin would violate a peace deal if it's made in terms that would position him for a violation. But President Trump, of course, views it very differently, and I think it was disturbing during 2025 to see him bending over backwards to try to flatter Putin, rolling out literal red carpet for him, for this war criminal in Alaska. That was in August, and it was troubling to see him parroting Kremlin talking points so many times throughout the war, throughout the year, blaming Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky for starting the war, which is just bizarrely anachronistic in many ways. And it was troubling to see him propose deal after deal that would reward Russia's aggression and even give them territory that they have failed to conquer after trying for 4 years, even in some cases 9 or 10 years to conquer. And then to see President Trump vote alongside Russia in the United Nations, a resolution that was to condemn Russia's invasion. That happened back in February. And not even China or Cuba went that far. Those are allies of Russia, and even they abstained. But President Trump had America vote alongside Russia. So that was all just very troubling, I think, for the Americans to see and for the Europeans to see. And it all really does help Vladimir Putin a great deal. Each time President Trump comes to him with a new peace plan, Putin feigns interest, he feigns engagement, and then he manufactures some kind of a pretext to reject it and to keep on killing. I think we went through 5 or 6 different cycles of that during 2025. And it may seem like kind of a pointless charade for Putin to go through that, but that is not at all the case. In one of the latest iterations of this dance, I think it was in November, that the United States had been discussing allowing Ukraine to use Tomahawk missiles to strike energy infrastructure deep inside of Russia. And I think that would have considerably increase the economic pain that the Russians are feeling and hopefully compel Putin to settle for some sort of negotiated peace. But just as those plans were being discussed, that's when Russian officials contacted some U.S. officials. They pretended to be interested in a new peace plan, and with that, all of those discussions about U.S. Tomahawks going to Ukraine came to a quick end. So that's extremely valuable for Vladimir Putin. He was able to use some real Sun Tzu kind of subterfuge there, some art of war kind of manipulation to take out those tomahawks with his words and with his deception without firing a shot. So this was a defining part of 2025, just seeing this over and over again with President Trump trying to flatter and kind of win President Putin over, and seeing Putin use it as a chance to decrease the pressure on Russia. And I think that it was very sobering seeing American credibility squandered and seeing America side with Russia. But that was one of the defining trends of 2025.
And I think you can certainly see that in our magazine covers. We have at least two magazine covers on peace deals, and I think we had 3 pretty beefy articles on the flaws of Donald Trump's approach to peace. And this is, you mentioned it's one of the biggest news stories of 2025. I think it's one of the most important ones for us to be talking about, because this is a news story that really does get to the heart of why a lot of the news that is happening the way that it is. Because if you're talking about how do we bring peace, how do we get peace between different people, and when you're talking about the human heart, and you're talking about Jesus Christ himself, one of his titles is the Prince of Peace. This is something the Bible says, the way of peace man doesn't know. And this is where you're talking about human beings that have a human spirit, and their ability to get along with each other or their inability to get along with each other. That's a spiritual subject. That is something that man cannot figure out for himself and cannot learn about through science and experimentation or material studies or universities. This is knowledge that is completely inaccessible to man. And it requires the Bible. And when you look at even like why Bible prophecy, why we have prophetic events, it's to show mankind, well, God rules in the kingdom of men, to expose man's evil human nature, to expose man's need for God. And so when you see Donald Trump going around and failing to bring peace, I mean, I think even as a human effort, you could do better. And he's made a lot of pretty foolish mistakes and getting into appeasement and things like that. But we are on a spiritual subject. We're on biblical territory. And so that, I think, is a big part of the reason why we have so much to say on that. And the cover article of our October Trumpet print, The Roadblock to Peace, gets into a lot of that critical spiritual truth. The picture on that cover is why peace talks fail. So, I mean, this year we've seen man's heart exposed in a lot of the different news stories, but in man's failure to produce peace, man's inhumanity to man, it's exposing the human heart and man's need for God to come and change the human heart. It's about our need for repentance. So an important story to keep focused on. But aside from all of those things that we've talked about just earlier, we talked about on the show last week, what are the other big stories from the United States, Andrew?
I feel like aside from the Donald Trump's religious revival and the many flawed peace deals, that the biggest story of the year from the Anglo-American region is just Donald Trump's approach to trade. That was another one of his big campaign promises, is he wants America to be more self-sufficient from other nations. He wants America to be a manufacturing powerhouse, and he wants to increase tax revenue through tariffs rather than income tax. So he's enacted many tariffs throughout the year. Some of them have been struck down. Some of them have made it through. The big issue here, though, is that as that trade deficit goes down and American trade with China goes down, it's like, what fills the gap? Because China, they're not just taking this reduced trade lying down, they're forming trade deals with other nations. So China's actually ran a $1 trillion trade surplus this year. I think it's their biggest trade surplus everywhere. So they might be not trading as much with the United States, but they are emerging as the leader of a third world trade bloc, where countries in Latin America, countries in Africa are trading more with China. Europe and China are trading more together. And that's leading to one of our keynote prophecies in Isaiah 23 about a mart of nations that economically besieges the United States. And I'm not necessarily blaming Donald Trump, saying that this mart of nations is a curse on America because he refuses to, or because he put these tariffs on China. I actually think there's probably, the way China treats the Uyghurs and other things, a strong moral argument that could be made that America should be trading less with China. But God does specify that because of America's many other sins, that an economic mart of nations that besieges it, that's in Leviticus 26. It's like, if you break my Sabbaths and worship idols and don't follow my statutes, I'll bring a foreign enemy from afar to besiege you in your gates. And we're seeing, at least in response to these tariffs Donald Trump has made, many nations in Latin America and in Africa teaming up with China into a trade bloc that in the future would have the power to besiege America.
And it also ties into some of the stories we were talking about with Europe too, because this lack of trade with the United States, particularly car tariffs, it's hitting Germany's auto industry, Germany's manufacturing industry very hard. One response to that is to say, we can't sell cars. We've got production capacity sitting idle. We can make tanks. Like the arms industry is booming, and that's been a major story of this last year, where you've had civilian industries repurpose themselves to focus on this military sector. But even so, like, Germany's car exports is vastly larger than Germany's arms exports. So that, even though it's quite a pronounced trend, it hasn't made up for the loss of car exports, chemical exports, all these other exports entirely. And that's that's putting a lot of pressure on Germany, and you could see that helping, or it will play a role in leading to the rise of this German strongman and some of the pressure around that. What else do we have from from the United States that's driving a lot of world news?
I think we've also, another big story in the United States is just the continuing problems resulting from Biden's immigration policy. Joe Biden, during his presidency, he let in 10 million illegal immigrants. Now, Donald Trump really exposed how much of a calculated attack on America that was, because he pretty much sealed the border in weeks. Sent some military troops down there. The amount of people pouring into the United States has drastically fallen, but you still got all these illegal immigrants here, and now you're having his fulfilling a campaign promise to deport a lot of these drug cartel agents and other illegal immigrants here. But especially over the summer, you had some pretty intense rioting in LA, people waving the Mexican flag, protesting these deportations. Even a prominent politician in Mexico speaking from the Mexican Senate, saying that it's unjust for Donald Trump to deport people from California or Arizona or Nevada or states like that, because those states are rightfully Mexican territory anyway, territory that was actually taken from Mexico during the U.S.-Mexico War, back in the 1840s. Which really kind of gave us a preview that we highlighted in our August print edition in an article co-authored by myself and Mr. Stephen Fleury, "The LA Riots Are a Foreign Invasion," highlighting that one of the curses in Ezekiel 26, it says if you disobey God's statutes, a foreign enemy will besiege you in your gates. He also talks about your high and fenced walls coming down, the stranger within your gates getting up very high, you coming down very low. Other prophecies in Isaiah 1 and verse 7 talks about strangers or aliens burning your cities with fire within your midst. So talking about civil war-like conditions, that will be one of the curses that happen during the trade siege that comes to America if they don't repent and follow God's laws and statutes. And so we've talked already this program about the developing trade bloc against the United States, and now we also got a preview in last summer about just how bad some of the rioting can get because of a lot of the illegal immigration that was allowed to happen into the United States over the past 4 years.
Well, thank you for that, Andrew. The idea for this show and getting us all around the table, it came from one of our occasional correspondents from Canada, Mr. Abraham Blondeau, who we couldn't quite get it put together in time to include him. But because it was his idea, I think we did want to include the big story from Canada over the last year. So I'm sure he'll be very pleased to hear from you about what's the biggest story from Canada in 2025.
Yeah, I think it's definitely got to be the new Prime Minister. There's a big disappointment for Canadians, or especially conservative Canadians. They've suffered under the Trudeau administration for years. As soon as President Trump came into office, he started relentlessly mocking Mr. Trudeau about being the governor of Canada, and how Canada was the 51st state, and how Canada wasn't a real country. And then the tariffs we've already talked about, imposing tariffs on Canada's auto industry in ways that really hurt the Canadian economy. And I think it's not really an exaggeration to say that Donald Trump pretty much teased Justin Trudeau out of office. There was hope that a conservative candidate would come in, and then they basically almost did what they did with Italy back in the day when a central banker, Mario Draghi, took over and imposed a technocratic government. You actually had one of Mario Draghi's colleagues at the Bank of International Settlements, Mark Carney, come in. Trudeau resigned. He just took his place. And he eventually did win an election, but it took a long time to get to it. For a while, he was basically just running this technocratic government here, where he's continuing a lot of the Trudeau policies. Mark Carney, he's born in Canada. He's ethnically Irish. When he speaks in Europe, he oftentimes identifies as European instead of American. Like I said, worked with Mario Draghi at the Bank of International Settlements. Has definitely made it known that he wants closer relationships with the European Union than with the United States. Even somehow managed to get himself roped into the Rearm Europe program. It's this program in the European Union where they give loans to countries to help remilitarize in response to the Russian invasion. And so I guess they said since the European Union and Canada do technically share a border in the Arctic, they're giving Canada money to build some new military bases in the Arctic regions, especially around Greenland, area Donald Trump's expressed some interest in, showing a way that under Mark Carney, Canada's really emerging as a country at odds with the United States and really looking to draw much closer to this revived Holy Roman Empire in Europe. Mr. Blondeau, who, like I said, sadly couldn't be here today, even wrote an article in our July edition titled, "Is Canada Being Taken Over by Europe?" Really saying that, like, if this trend continues and Canada keeps drawing closer to Europe, that would even be a really good staging point from Europe's point. I think there's even one paragraph in here about kind of using like Cuba and Canada, like Latin America, as like a pincher movement and in Europe's attempts to besiege and surround the United States. So a lot of people have a lot of strong opinions about Donald Trump's comments about both Cuba and Greenland, although he does seem to recognize that those are really two geographic weak points that an enemy in the Eastern Hemisphere could use against America. And if America doesn't turn back to God, that actually may very well end up being with Cuba drawing closer to the European Union, Denmark drawing closer to the European Union, Canada moving more towards Europe, giving Europe some very strong footholds, even in the Western Hemisphere here.
So even in US news, the rise of Europe and this growing opposition to the United States is still a major story. But we can turn now to Jeremiah. You've already chimed in on a few things relating to Russia. Apart from that, what are the big trends out of Asia for 2026?
Yeah, I would say the number one story for 2025 is that the leaders of Russia, China, and India spent the year deepening their alignment with each other and building a powerful troika between these three massive Asian nations. And these countries, Russia, China, and India, they have a combined population of 3 billion people, and they generate 22% of the world's gross domestic product. So this is an extremely populous and powerful grouping, and they are all three increasingly fueled by anti-American sentiments and a vision, just a common goal of reducing U.S. power and increasing their own global power. So the purpose of this Russia, China, India group is really to reshape the geopolitical landscape in Asia and beyond. And 2025 was a very big year for their cohesion. Now, for Russia and China, of course, this is not really news. Those two have been drawing close, building a formidable partnership for over a decade now as they try to dismantle the global order. But India's willingness to join Russia and China was long in doubt. And that's because the Indians always demanded a high degree of strategic autonomy. You know, they didn't want to be anyone's pawn or lapdog. And India long managed to kind of walk the tightrope in between Russia and the United States, even as both Russia and the US tried to pull India deeper into their spheres. But what we've seen over the last few years is India kind of giving up that tightrope walk and tilting more overtly toward Russia. We see this in India's increasing purchases of Russian weaponry. We see it in the diplomatic support that India gives to Russia in various international bodies. We see it probably most notably in the energy purchases that India has maintained and even increased dramatically since Russia brought its war against Ukraine full scale back in the early part of 2022. That's been a huge part of what has helped and empowered Putin to keep on funding the war. So that's been a major boon to Russia. So that's been kind of the overall trend for the last few years. But in 2025, a new factor was introduced into this equation, and that was the Trump administration's erratic tariff policy. You know, tariffs on, tariffs off, tariffs of this amount, tariffs of that amount, tariffs for this reason. No, wait, they're actually for that reason. And in the case of India, it's hard to see how President Trump's tariffs are anything but geopolitically ill-advised. And they just injected a great deal of new tension into India's relationship with America, and that ended up further tilting India toward Russia. So because of all of this, India just kept on moving further away from the US, and by the end of 2025, we could say that its posture toward Russia had moved from cautious tilt to active alignment. So that was notable enough. But then we also saw an even more dramatic thaw throughout 2025 in the India-China relationship. You know, these two have a decades-long rivalry, very severe border tensions, quite a tense competition just for strategic influence over Asia. But in early July, a group of Indian delegates traveled to Beijing. That was the first visit of that kind in about 5 years. And during the trip, they agreed to find ways to improve their trade, to kind of reset diplomatic relations, and to further de-escalate their various border tensions as well. And in the months that followed, we saw India restore visa services to Chinese tourists. We saw the two resume direct flights between their two nations. And China even ended up removing curbs on its exports of rare earths and fertilizers to India. All of that was very notable in bringing China and India together. And then in September, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi actually traveled to China to meet with Chinese leader Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. That was on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Summit in Tianjin, China. So just an extremely significant meeting that happened there. And it all shows that China and India are burying the hatchet, and they're doing it under the guidance of Vladimir Putin's Russia. Putin is really the one bringing all three of them together. And the National Security Journal said in 2025 rather, that this shows that this new Russia-China-India bloc is becoming a fundamental factor in Asian and global politics. And this alignment between Russia, China, and India, it is something that the trumpet has been expecting based on Bible prophecy. You can see those prophecies in Revelation 16, for example, Daniel 11, most specifically, I think, in Ezekiel chapter 38. So it was very dramatic throughout 2025 to see these nations coming together, to see this prophesied alignment really taking shape. And I think that in the present year, we will see this troika grow even more powerful and become an even bigger factor in Asian and global politics.
Just to interject, even in the Biden administration, India has been buying oil from Russia and refining it and reselling it, for example, to Europe. And at one point, Trump said, we are sanctioning India because of how they are financing the Russian war, if I remember right. But obviously, it did backfire, and Russia and India just doubled down on that. They were not afraid of those sanctions at all, or those tariffs at all at the time.
It's a very good point. Yes, I think that he hoped that his measures would drive a wedge between Russia and India, bring India back on side, but it didn't go as planned.
I think what's fascinating about this is, Herbert W. Armstrong talked about Russia. I mean, he talked about this alliance based on Bible prophecy coming together and these kings of the East. And in particular, he had a lot to say about Russia and China. So all the way back even in 1934, he talked about two great military powers rising. One, the Roman Empire by a federation of 10 nations, which, like 1934, this is long before anyone was talking about the European Union Federation. But then he said, well, the other would be, he said, Russia with her allies, possibly China or Japan. And a few decades later, that forecast looked pretty foolish. like Russia and China were at the, well, they did go to war. There were some I think more robust even than border skirmishes between the two. And yet the plain truth still talked about, or, this magazine Mr. Armstrong founded and ran, still talked about this coming Russia-China alliance. The plain truth said China knows that in this highly industrialized age, she can only accomplish this dream of dominating the world as an ally of Russia. And they continued this throughout this time period. And you look at these same Bible prophecies, and they also talk about India being a major part of that as well. And for India, it's like, we can read on this history, and we can read, like, it was really remarkable that Mr. Armstrong forecast this, and now it's happened. And with India, we get to live it. Like, China, that relationship has intensified a lot over the last 5 years, but it was there before the last 5 years. This India relationship, India had a very close relationship to Russia, but they've also had a close relationship to the United States. They've been very antagonistic towards China because China's a Pakistan ally, and there's the India-Pakistan tension. So to see this troika come together, and we're still watching it, is again the opportunity to see the power of the Bible in real time. It's really exciting. This is a wonderful way for you to increase your faith in this book and to appreciate the power that's in every word and every verse of this book. And as we say so often, that has implications far beyond watching world news. That has implications for your life, that when you read a verse and you think, oh, do I need to make some changes to make my life more in conformance with what's written here? Does that really have that much power and authority? Yes, it does. And we're seeing that now with Russia, China, and now India coming along. And it is just really exciting to see fulfilled prophecy before our eyes in that way. And another important part of that, as it was even hinted in that 1934 quote, is Japan. Now, we certainly don't see a Russia, China, India, Japan kind of alliance really taking clear shape right now. That is coming. What we do see, and a part of this that we are seeing fulfilled that was forecast, is Japan's return to militarization. And that, again, we saw that before this year, but we've seen that take a major step forward this year.
That's exactly right. Yes, the general trend of Japan normalizing its military and amassing just obscene amounts of firepower, it has been underway for years now. But 2025 was, I think, in many ways, a particularly big year for that. Japan got a new prime minister in 2025, Sanae Takaichi. She's the first female prime minister Japan has ever had, and she is a hawk. She's very militarily minded and just firmly committed to military expansion. She's been busy positioning Japan to take a tougher stance toward China and North Korea, and that, of course, means more Japanese firepower. And she does have the nation on track now to be spending 2% of gross domestic product on military by March, which is about 2 years ahead of the schedule that her predecessors had set, and that schedule was already wildly ambitious. So Japan is really racing toward fully normalized military power now under Takaichi, and just rapidly building it into a fully integrated, ultra-modern assemblage of land, sea, and air forces. And it was also very notable that in December, one of Takaichi's senior officials even said that Japan's firepower needs to include nuclear weapons. That's a chilling possibility when you consider the fanaticism of the Japanese during World War II. But it is a topic that's being discussed more and more often at the highest echelons of Japanese government now. And of course, Japan is home to a highly developed civilian nuclear program. It's home to a whole pantheon of world-class physicists and engineers. So Japan could really become nuclear armed within a matter of months if it decided to do so. And right now, U.S. leaders are cheering this on, and they're even encouraging Japan to accelerate its return to militarism, and that is because American leaders right now see Japan only as an ally, as a steadfast democracy that can be counted on to help them defend against authoritarian regimes in China.
Same story as Europe.
Very similar. Yeah, it's almost a perfect parallel. So they want Japan to take on a greater burden in defending the free world. But Bible prophecy, as you mentioned a moment ago, shows that Japan will actually turn against the U.S. in the near future, and it will throw its lot in with that Russia, China, India bloc that was mentioned a moment ago. So 2025 was just a major year for Japan's march toward remilitarization. And here again, I think that we should expect the current year to keep on pushing this trend forward with even greater speed.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that, Jeremiah. Well, Mihailo Zekic, our Middle East correspondent, has been sitting patiently on Zoom throughout this entire time, ready to update us on the latest from the Middle East. Mihailo, you have your chance.
Yes, there's obviously been a lot of conflict in the Middle East, a lot of wars, a lot of unpredictability. I'd say the biggest trend we've got to take a look at is the first year in power of the new government in Syria. The Syrian rebels ousted a longtime dictator, brutal man, Bashar al-Assad, out of power this time in December of 2024. And we've gotten a look at what President Ahmed al-Sharaa and his HTS faction, a former affiliate of al-Qaeda, have been able to do. Well, what's the verdict? Well, much of Assad's legacy has been undone to their credit. The prisons have been opened, mass graves exhumed, records and archives opened, chemical weapons finally documented. But we can see that Sharaa and enough people under him at least are staying true, at least in some respects, to their jihadist foundations. In March, over 1,000 Alawites and other minorities were massacred by forces associated with Sharaa. We later had massacres of the Druze minority, which got Israel involved. We've seen foreign fighters, people that migrated to Syria from other Muslim parts of the world for no other reason than to spread jihad. They've been integrated into the military, even though that was a red line. If that Syria wasn't to cross, if they wanted normalization with the rest of the world. There's even evidence that some Palestinian groups, like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, have been found safe haven under Sharaa's government and are consolidating their forces. But despite all that, President Trump, if we were going to speak about flawed peace deals, is trying to graft Syria into the community of nations again. Sharaa was the first Syrian head of state to have an invitation to the White House. He visited a couple months ago. He had his personal sanctions removed, sanctions against Syria removed. He was grafted into the coalition to fight ISIS. And President Trump is even pressuring Israel to accept peace treaties of sorts with Syria. Just a few days ago, there was an announcement of Israel and Syria opening up a new communications center brokered by the United States to share intelligence. This ties into a prophecy in Psalm 83, which we go to often, of the Hagarenes being involved in an alliance that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. That's in verse 4, and that includes the United States. It brings to mind a article Mr. Fleury wrote about 5 years ago called Deadly Flaw in Mideast Peace Deals, which was about the Abraham Accords and everything President Trump did with that, which was about the Abraham Accords in President Trump's first term between Israel and the UAE. The UAE is a much tamer country than the current government in Syria. If what Mr. Fleury wrote about how this is setting up America and Israel up for betrayal applies to the UAE, it certainly applies to Syria. And in this case, we're seeing America graft itself into this country that's led by a guy whose organization helped attack the Twin Towers in 9/11.
Well, thank you for that, Mihailo. I think another massive story from the Middle East and a major theme from the last year is, well, as Mr. Fleury put it in the trumpet print, Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's rising lion, where this has just been an incredible year for Benjamin Netanyahu. He's been under incredible pressure. Obviously, there's the response to October 7th, the war in Gaza, the pressure from Donald Trump to sign various peace deals, and he's kind of got to untangle this knotty problem where a lot of these peace deals are pretty disastrous, but at the same time, he needs American backing and weapons, so which is the lesser of two evils? Then, while all of this is going on, he is being indicted, he's going through court cases, through various pretty trumped-up charges, and yet he still has these strikes on Iran and these strikes on Hezbollah and deals with Iran's missile system. And it was incredible. Like, he was having to be in court during the day and then go home and stay up all night with the generals plotting to take out Iran's nuclear program. And perhaps some of the most dramatic footage of the year was then Iran's attack on Tel Aviv that Israel just did an incredible job of intercepting. So, Mihailo, can you fill us in a bit on some of those stories?
Yes, I think the big example of that would be the Israeli strikes against Iran's nuclear program in June, attacking famous sites like Natanz and Iraq. A couple of weeks later, President Trump entered in with striking Fordo with bunker buster bombs, the most powerful non-nuclear bombs. There is evidence to suggest that Iran has recuperated a bit and is working on their own nuclear program and is working on creating a nuclear warhead after a long wait, but they may have been even closer with everything that's happened with the strikes. And there's also, of course, again, speaking of lopsided peace deals, President Trump pressuring Mr. Netanyahu to get into peace deals with Hamas and basically surrendering in exchange for the hostages being released. The hostages coming back are obviously a good thing, but the end result of these several peace deals, I believe there's 3 ceasefires in total, is that Hamas now is still armed and in Gaza, and even though people say that that's not going to last, nobody has any suggestion on how to make that happen. And that's certainly a thorn in Netanyahu's side that he's still dealing with. But as you said, it's been amazing that he's been able to survive this long and get as much done as he has with all this going on, all this international pressure.
Well, thank you very much for that, Mihailo, and to all the rest of our panelists. This has been a pretty whirlwind review of what's been going on over the last 12 months. But I'll finish with one thing that we've been working on internally for not 12 months, but several months, and that is our new He Was Right book. Because we've been quite quickly throwing out a lot of references to different prophecies, from Russia and China uniting, and the fall of the US economic system and how that's going to affect Europe coming together as 10 kings, or the Middle East and this kind of secretive anti-Israel alliance in the Middle East led by Germany. We haven't taken the time to prove to you in detail from the Bible where these prophecies come from, but that doesn't mean that that's not important. And we would love for you to be able to do that. And our book, He Was Right, is a great place to do that, because all of this is grounded on biblical revelation to Herbert W. Armstrong. And you can prove it from your Bible. And but he explained all of this decades ago. And in a lot of ways, the fact that they were explained decades ago just makes it all the more impressive that it was spelled out before it happened. And so you can see how Mr. Armstrong spelled it out. You can see why it will take you through the scriptures. And you can get a much deeper look as to why we made these forecasts. Really, on this show, we've just tried to show you how the whole general sweep of news for the last year or so just comes straight from your Bible. And we would love for that to spur you into a more detailed look at your Bible. And He Was Right is a great place to do that for Bible prophecy. So you can get that on our website, thetrumpet.com. You can read it online. You can order your own free print copy that you can study alongside your Bible. We would be very happy to share that with you. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. Thank you for Jesse Hester and Matthew Friesen for engineering and production. If you have any questions or comments, you can get in touch with us at trumpetworld@thetrumpet.com. We'll be back on Friday with our regular Week in Review show. Until then, keep watching your world.